Shabbos Daf Ayin Tes is devoted to the halachos of hides, animal skins that are used to make parchment, on which we write mezuzahs, tefillin, and sifrei Torah. And for all of these, we are going to discuss the proper halacha for carrying, and even some about how you make them. So the daf can be divided into two halves. The first half discusses the processing of the skin. At what stage of the skin's processing is the Mishnah's halacha for the minimum size for carrying? What does that apply to? And what is the halacha for other stages of processing? Then the second half of the daf will be discussing, once it's already processed into parchment, into cloth, what is its halacha? What are you allowed to use it for? Is there a difference between tefillin, mezuzah, and then at the end we'll even bring in sifrei Torah. Okay, so let's discuss the first half of the daf, where we are discussing animal hides, where it's not parchment yet, it's unprocessed skin, or it's skin in the various stages of processing. So our Mishnah had said that the shear is, if you carry enough skin that can be used to make an amulet, a kameya, that's when you're chayav the isur d'oraisa of carrying. The Gemara shows that Rava asked Rav Nachman about several other levels of processing. I want to know what the halacha is. And all of them, Rav Nachman said that they're all the same. And the Gemara is going to present 5 kashas on this. The first 3 are by Rava himself, in which he'll show other places in which processed and unprocessed materials don't have the same halacha. Then we'll have 2 more kashas where we specifically show that processed leather and unprocessed leather have different halachos. The answers to Rava's 3 kashas will all be the same, and the answers to the other 2 will be that we are referring to different types of levels of processing of skin. So let's begin. The Gemara says that Rava asked Rav Nachman. We saw in our Mishnah that the halacha is if you carry animal skin, it's an isur d'oraisa if you have enough to make a kameh. That's the minimum amount to be considered significant enough for an isur d'oraisa. What's the halacha if you carried skin that not only wasn't processed into parchment and wasn't even tanned at all? It did not undergo ibud. It's raw skin. And what's the halacha about actually tanning skin? How much skin are you violating the isur d'oraisa of tanning? What are all these halachas? So he said they're all the same. They're all the minimum amount of a piece big enough to write a kameya on. And he says, I'll prove it to you. My proof is that you can see another situation in which the processing of the raw material and the advanced material is the same. What's that? It's by cloth. How do you make thread? You take fibers from, let's say, hair of a goat or a sheep, and then you have to comb them out, you have to bleach them, and you have to color them. Then you finally spin them. So the shear for all these things, a brisa says, is twice the width of the space between your index finger and your middle finger. So you see that in its unprocessed stage, meaning the combing and the bleaching, it's the same size as in the actual spinning of the thread. So you see the early stages and the later stages of development are the same size. The same thing therefore applies to processing animal hides. The tanning and the untanned and the tanned already all have the same size. So now Rav is going to have 3 kashas, because he's going to show 3 situations in which the unprocessed and the processed are not the same size. They have different shurim, and the answer in all of them will be the same. The answer for all 3 of his cases will be that in those situations, it's not worth a person's effort to process a smaller amount. But once he has a processed larger amount, then a smaller piece is already significant. So as far as carrying a processed amount, a small piece is significant. But as far as processing it, or carrying unprocessed amount, it's not significant to have such a small piece. You need a bigger piece because it's too much effort to go through to get just a small piece. So what are his 3 kashas? So the first one is discussing the making of the dyes that are used to color cloth. And we have a brisa which says as follows. the dyes were made by soaking plants in water until the coloring leached out of the plant into the water and formed the dye. So if you already soaked the plants in the water and you already have the dye, so the minimum size to be significant of the dye itself is enough to color a small piece of cloth that you would use as a sample if you plan on selling a colored cloth. That size is also the same amount that you would use to wrap a spool of thread that the weaver uses to weave through the cross threads. Now, that's if you already made the dye. What if you just have the plants? You didn't make the dye yet. So, for example, if you have nut shells or pomegranate peels or a plant called satis or fua, all these, it's only considered significant enough if they are enough plant to make enough dye used to color a piece of cloth that's attached to a woman's hair covering, which is a larger amount. So you see that the processed stage, meaning the dye itself, has a smaller shear than the unprocessed plants themselves. And where it says again, the answer is that that's different because nobody will go through the effort to make the dye for just that small amount. You need to use a larger amount to actually make the dye itself. Rava now asks us a second kasha, and that's from a brisa discussing seeds. So as far as carrying seeds on Shabbos, the minimum size is a machlokas. It's either 5 seeds or enough seeds to fill the volume of a dried fig. But as far as fertilizing the already growing plants, so then it's got to be a full-grown. Then it's enough if it's just one plant. You don't have to have 5 or a large amount. Which plant? So then it's a machlokas if it's fertilizing a stalk of cabbage or a stalk of leek. But either way, one is enough. So you see that once it's already grown, one is enough. But the seeds, which are unprocessed plants, for that you need a large amount, either 5 or the size of a fig. Gemara says that's different. Nobody's going to go carrying one seed. Nobody's going to plant one seed. So one seed for planting is not significant. Once it already grows, then it's significant enough to fertilize. Okay, Ravana has the third kash, and this is a discussion which we've already seen earlier. Making cement. What's the minimum amount to make cement itself, and what's the minimum amount of cement? So as far as the processed cement, where it's already cement, the minimum amount we said is enough to cover the opening of a oven that is used to melt different types of metal. But as far as the water that you're going to use to mix into the clay, so that's wastewater, and we saw that the minimum amount is a revius, which is enough to make more than the minimum amount of clay. So again, the Gemara says the same answer, that the processed and the unprocessed have different amounts because nobody's going to make clay in that small amount. You will, however, carry out, once you have clay already made, so a smaller amount is considered significant. Okay, now the Gemara has 2 kashas on Rav Nachman's actual halacha. Rav Nachman had said that there's no difference between the processed and the unprocessed skin. The tanned and the untanned, the size is always the same. Now, however, we have a brisa that says that the size is different. And the brisa is brought by Rav Chibaram in the name of Ula. And it says as follows, that there are 3 levels of processing of animal skin. There's one which is called matzah, that's unprocessed at all, nothing was performed on it. Then there's one called chipa, that has one of the 3 processing steps. It was salted, but it didn't have anything else. Then you have diphthera, which has 2 out of the 3 steps. It was salted and it was rubbed with flour, but it was not yet fully finished, which would be when you rubbed crushed nuts on it. Okay, so these are the 3 stages of unprocessed skin. Once all 3 steps were performed, it's already called tan leather. It's not called skin. Now, what's the minimum size for these things? So it says if it's completely unprocessed without any steps, then the size is enough to wrap a weight. The weights that they used to measure the weight of things were made out of lead, and they would sometimes rub out. Therefore, they wrap them in animal skins. That size is also the same as a quarter of a pumpedicin liter. Now, if it is processed 1 step, then the minimum size is enough to make an amulet. That's like our Mishnah. And if it has 2 out of the 3 steps, then the minimum size is enough to make a smallest divorce document, which is the smallest of the 3. Either way, we see here that the unprocessed leather has a much different size than the processed. So it's not like Rav Nachman said that they're all the same. So Gemara says, no, this is talking about really unprocessed. Rav Nachman was referring to where it was ready for processing. This is referring to it was fresh off the animal's back. that was really moist. It has to be dried first. So in a situation like that, then it's a different halacha. But that's not what Rav Nachman was referring to. Okay, now we get to our fifth and final kasha, and that's here's a Mishnah that says that there are different sizes for what type of cloth is mekabel tumah, whether it's tumah zav or tumah mace, and the sizes are as follows. If it is woven cloth, then it's 3 tvachim by 3 tvachim. If it's sackcloth, it's 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim. If it's skin, meaning leather, then it's 5 tvachim by 5 tvachim. And if it's a woven mat from reeds, then it's 6 tvachim by 6 tvachim. We've had this Mishnah quoted a number of times earlier in this Masechta. But this Brisa finishes off and says that the same sizes apply for Tumah, also apply for carrying on Shabbos. The minimum amount to be significant to be in violation of the Issa D'Oraisa of carrying on Shabbos. So you see here that there's different sizes for skin. Here it says 5 tachim by 5 tachim, which is not the same as our Mishnah, which had said enough to write a kameh, which is much smaller. Someone says, no, this is referring to a different type of leather altogether. This is referring to where it was cooked in hot water and it's hardened and it's used to make hard things. It's not used for writing. So that's not what Rav Nachman was referring to. Rav Nachman was referring to process and non-process for parchment. This is referring to make other things altogether. Okay, now we get to the next discussion, which is about actual parchment itself. So by way of introduction, when an animal's skin is removed from it, it has 2 layers. That entire object together is called gevil. It can be then separated into 2 layers. The outer layer is called klaf, because it peels off, like from the word klipa, and the inner layer is called a duchsustus. You can make different types of parchment from each of these. And the Gemara will show generally tefillin are made from klaf and mezuzahs are made from duchsustus. There'll be some discussion as to whether you can switch. First, we will discuss the minimum size for carrying on Shabbos to be in violation of the Issa D'Oraisa. Then we're going to have a brisa, which is a contradiction to our Mishnah. I'm going to try a few attempts to fit the two together. The brisa will also end up being self-contradictory. Then we'll have a statement of Rav as to what you can actually use to make tefillin and mezuzah, and we will have a couple of challenges to Rav's statement, and we will try to resolve them all. Okay, so first of all, our Mishnah said that the minimum size for klaf, which is parchment, the minimum size for that is enough to write the smallest parsha in tefillin, which is just 1 parsha of Shema. Now we have a brisa that says differently. The brisa says that the smallest size for klaf and the chsustus is enough to write a mezuzah. So you see that klaf against klaf, there's a contradiction here. The Mishnah says that it's smallest 1 parsha of Shema, but the Brisa says it's enough to write a mezuzah, which is 2 parshas of Shema in it, which is a larger size. So the Gemara tries to fit these two together. First of all, the Gemara says when the Brisa said mezuzah, it didn't mean mezuzah on the door, it meant mezuzah inside your tefillin. The word mezuzah is used here to mean just the scroll, and the rolled up parchment inside the tefillin is called mezuzah. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? When do you ever find that the parsha of tefillin is called mezuzah? The Gemara says, yes, there is another brisa which we do have, which refers to the scrolls inside tefillin as mezuzahs, and that's a brisa discussing whether or not tefillin are matame your hands. Why would that happen? We wanted to make sure that food, especially truma, was kept away from holy things so that the mice wouldn't eat them, and therefore we said that tefillin and many other holy objects are matame your hands. The question is, what part of tefillin are matame your hands? So we have 3 opinions in this brisa. The first one is that the straps are matame your hands when they're connected to the tefillin. The second one is that only the boxes are matame your hands, and the third one is only the parshas inside the boxes are matame your hands. That's the scroll. And when it says the parshas inside, it calls the mezuzah atzma, calls it the mezuzah. So you see that there is a brisa which refers to the inside scrolls as mezuzah. So the Gemara says no, but this brisa can't be referring to the inside scrolls as mezuzah, because later in the same brisa it actually talks about mezuzah. What does it say? The first part of the brisa is what we just said, that the minimum size for klaf or the chsustus, it says, is enough to write tefillin. Later in the brisa, it says that the minimum size for klaf is enough to write a mezuzah. So you see, first it's talking about tefillin, and then it talks about mezuzah. First it refers to mezuzah, and then it refers to tefillin. You can't say that when it said mezuzah it was also talking about tefillin, because it calls tefillin. It doesn't call tefillin mezuzah. Now, once we saw this, the brisa is also self-contradictory, because in the first part it says that the minimum size for a klaf or the chsustus is enough to write a mezuzah, and then later it says the minimum size for klaf is enough to write tefillin. So the Gemara ends up explaining the entire thing differently. When it says the minimum size for klaf and a duchsustus, it then goes each one at a time. The minimum size for klaf is tefillin. The minimum size for duchsustus, that's mezuzah. And therefore there is no contradiction to our Mishnah, which says that the minimum size for klaf is tefillin. Okay, now I have the statement of Rav, and several potential proofs against Rav, several answers, and then several possible supports to Rav. And then we're going to revise our understanding of Rav altogether. Now, Rav is referring to whether you can write tefillin or mezuzahs on the wrong material. Like we said, there are two layers of animal skin. There's klaf, the outer layer, and duchsustus, the inner layer. Tefillin is generally written on klaf and mezuzah on a duchsustus. Now we have a statement of Rav that says that just like you're allowed to use klaf for tefillin, you're also allowed to use duchsustus for tefillin. So for the vast majority of this sugya, we're going to assume that mezuzah has to be written on duchsustus, not klaf. And Rav's chiddush is that tefillin can be written on duchsustus as well as klaf. So the Gemara says, we have a raya against you. What do you mean? We just learned that the minimum size for carrying on Shabbos is different for mezuzahs and tefillin. It's different for klaf and duchsustus. For klaf, it's tefillin size, and for duchsustus, it's mezuzah size. It obviously shows that klaf can only be used for writing tefillin. You cannot use duchsustus for writing tefillin, otherwise the minimum size for duchsustus should be tefillin, not mezuzah. Somebody says, no, the correct way to write tefillin is certainly on klaf. You're not supposed to write tefillin on duchsustus, but if you do, it's kosher. That's what Rav means to say. So then has another kasha. We saw halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It's a brayta that says halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Tefillin has to be on klaf, mezuzah has to be on duchsustus, and they both have to be on the side where they meet. It has to be on the inner side of the klaf and the outer side of the duchsustus. So the Gemara says, okay, that's just the mitzvah. It's the way you're supposed to do it. But Rav is still correct that b'di evet, if you did it wrongly, it's still kosher if you use duchsustus for tefillin. The Gemara says, what are you talking about? There's a brayta that says if you change from this halacha, that it's possible, it's invalid. The Gemara says that's talking about the mezuzah part of it. Mezuzah has to be written on duchsustus. You can't use klaf for that, but tefillin you can use both. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? There's a brayta that says that if you changed in either of these two things, it's possible. Where it says either of these two things is not talking about tefillin, it's talking about two halachas in mezuzah. It's talking about the fact that if you're going to write it on klaf, it's no good. And if you write it on duchsustus, on the inner side, that's also no good. Those are the two halachas. That's what it means that both ways there's a psul. Okay, now the Gemara says there's another way I can answer this, and I can tell you that this entire thing, which says that if you did them wrongly, it's possible both ways, in both cases, is actually a machlekes about that, because you have a statement of Rav Acha, the name of Rav Achai bar Chanina, or maybe the name of Yaakov, the son of Rav Chanina, who says clearly that if you change and you did it wrong, it's kosher. Or Rav could be agreeing with that opinion, and that's why he says that if you use tefillin on duchsustus, it's kosher. Okay, now the Gemara tries to bring a proof to Rav, and it's Rav Papa who quotes a brisa of Tana Debe Menashe. The brisa says as follows. It says if you write it doesn't say what it is, and that's going to be what the discussion's about. If you write it on paper or on cloth, it's possible, but if you write it either on klaf or on duchsustus, or on the combination of the two, which is called gvil, it's kosher. All three of those are okay. So, says Rav Papa, what's it? It can't be mezuzah, because mezuzah we know is only kosher on a duchsustus. So it must be tefillin. And you see clearly that tefillin is kosher, even if it's on duchsustus, like Rav said. So Gemara says, no, that can't be, because tefillin's not kosher on gvil. And here it says you could use gvil, klaf, or duchsustus. So Gemara says it must be talking about a Sefer Torah. Sefer Torah is kosher on all three. And therefore it's no proof, because Rav was talking about tefillin, not a Sefer Torah. So now the Gemara says we have another brisa that may be a proof to Rav. This brisa is talking about repurposing one Sefer Kodesh for another thing. And it says that if you have tefillin or Sefer Torah that's worn out, can you cut out the parsha of the mezuzah and make a mezuzah out of it? So the brisa says no, because mezuzah is a lower kedusha than tefillin and Sefer Torah. You're not allowed to lower the kedusha of something. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. How could you possibly have tefillin that are going to turn into a mezuzah? Tefillin's written on klaf, mezuzah is written on a duchsustus. Must be that Rav is right, and that you're talking about where you had tefillin written on duchsustus, which Rav said is kosher, and that's what you want to make into a mezuzah. The Gemara says no. Maybe you just want to make klaf into a mezuzah. You want to use a klaf mezuzah. Gemara says, what do you mean? You can't make a mezuzah on klaf. You already know that. Nobody says you're allowed to do that. Gemara says, yeah, there is somebody who says that. Because we have a brisa that says, there's the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that you're allowed to write mezuzahs on klaf. As a matter of fact, he likes writing mezuzahs on klaf because it's a more durable material and mezuzah will last more. So now the Gemara says, once we've said this, that if Meir holds that you're allowed to write mezuzahs on klaf, I can reinterpret Rav's statement altogether. Rav had originally said that the halachos for klaf and duchsustus are the same. So we thought he meant that you're allowed to use duchsustus for tefillin. But it could be, he means to say you're allowed to use klaf for mezuzah. And then it all fits. He's agreeing with the opinion of Rabbi Meir.